Self-Nourishment from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. When you get up early in the morning by alarm, I think you don't feel so well. It's not so easy to come out and sit. Even after you started sitting, at first, you have to encourage yourself to sit well. Those are the waves of our mind, just waves. And in pure Zazen, there should not be any waves in our mind. But while you are sitting, those waves will, more and more, become smaller, and your effort will change into some subtle feeling. We say, pulling out the weeds, we make nourishment of the plant. We pull the weed and bury the weed near the plant to make it nourishment of the plant. So even though you have some difficulty in your practice, even though you have some waves while you are sitting, those weeds will help you. So we should not be bothered by the weeds you have in your mind. We should be grateful to the weeds you have in your mind, because eventually they will enrich your practice. If you have some experience how the weed you have in your mind will change into your mental nourishment in your practice makes remarkable progress. You feel the progress, you know. You can feel how it changes into the nourishment of yourself. Of course, it is not so difficult to give some philosophical interpretation to our practice, but that is not enough. We must have actual experience about how our weeds change into the nourishment. If you've ever worked for a large company, you've probably experienced the corporate motivational speaker seminar. They tend to be entertaining, high energy, and maybe contain a nugget of wisdom here and there. A few years ago, I was at such an event. I think Kent Julian was the speaker. I remember well the takeaway. It was an equation, E plus R equals O. That is, event plus response equals outcome. I'm not really sure who came up with that. Urban Meyers, for you Buckeye fans, he uses it, for example, in his book Above the Line. Jack Canfield, another motivational speaker, uses it too. I suspect there are others. In any case, the idea is simply that an event you encounter, combined with the response you muster, results in an outcome that you observe. As the theory goes, most people look at an undesirable outcome and blame the event. It's easy to look outward and say, if only that were different, then everything would be great. But the message these speakers sell is that over the long run, for success to happen, it's much more important to focus on the response. That is, look inward and see what's going on there. Much like a magician and their assistant, the speakers never really go into detail about specific outcomes, but rather they wave their hands around the R part of the equation while delivering their incantations. As you may have guessed from my tone, I'm not a huge fan of motivational speakers, but there I was, feeling entertained, listening for the nuggets, when it occurred to me that the message could be mapped over something else that had been with me for years. Carlos Castaneda is an author/anthropologist who wrote a series of books in the 60s and 70s, initially as part of a doctoral program at UCLA. The content was purported to be the result of field work he did as an apprentice to Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui shaman who is described as a master of ancient Toltec practices. There were lots of psychedelic events and descriptions in the earliest books. The series was somewhat controversial and believed by many to be fictional. But at the time I found the book struck a chord with me. Castaneda described the teachings he received as the warrior's way and himself as a spiritual warrior. Again, that's not a unique characterization. Castaneda and others list attributes of a spiritual warrior using words such as awareness, courage, discipline, commitment. For me, spiritual warrior sounded new agey and kind of trite, but it did capture a sense of intense pursuit that I could identify with. So what does Castaneda have to do with E plus R equals O? The Fire Within, his 7th book, I believe, related Don Juan's teaching of something he called the petty tyrant. The word tyrant has a more topical use in today's world politics, but let's call that big T tyranny. Castaneda was referring to something else, to people in our daily lives that have some power over us by way of their authority. Their interactions with us lead to distress and frustration and tend to keep us off balance. They are the button pushers. In some way, they appear to defeat us or form an obstacle to our progress. Castaneda writes that rather than crumbling in the face of petty tyranny, Don Juan taught him to face the challenge and use the interaction to further develop the attributes of the warrior. Or in the language of the motivational speaker, focus on the R and not the E. Respond by working on inner strength rather than wishing that the E, that is the petty tyrant, would just go away. It's important to note that Castaneda does not write that Don Juan's teaching was a step-by-step guide to controlling the O's, the outcomes of tyrannical interactions. In a nutshell, he is saying that progress on a warrior's path starts with focusing inward. But being a lover of abstraction, I would take it a step further. Petty tyranny does not need another person to have an impact on our path. Instead of another person being that E, that petty tyrant event, it could be my own thoughts or the messages and values of the culture that I was raised in and in which I live. One can experience a sort of tyranny of ideas. I went to another interesting seminar series that also happened to be through my employer. The speaker was Param Srikancha, a professor in the School of Business at Baldwin Wallace University.
He gives an all-day workshop called Why Life Sucks. As you might imagine, he's quite an animated guy. We broke the material down into 4 meetings that took place at our informal topic series, kind of a lunch conversation group. The first of these tackled the idea of chattering monkeys. Chattering monkeys is very simply a metaphor for the inner dialogue that everyone is presumed to have. I know I can hear and listen to my own inner voice. Since I can't literally hear anyone else's inner voice, I can only assume that they are there. Basically, Sri Kantra's message is to slow down, watch, and understand, listen to how your mind flows, and gradually you will come into some kind of balance. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that. I usually use the metaphor of leaves on the river, or Suzuki Roshi's mind weeds. But Sri Kantra described the experience as watching clouds float across the sky of the mind. I kind of like that one too. As with S plus E equals O and Castaneda, the goal described by Sri Kantra is not to control the external world in which we find ourselves, nor is action in the world shunned by these approaches, I should add. The goal isn't to overhaul our mind either. The effort so gently employed is meant to develop a skill that brings one more in balance, in harmony. However, before that skill is acquired, one tends to experience what I have called the tyranny of ideas. When someone cuts me off on the highway, it's because, well, they're a self-involved jerk who can't bother to take others into consideration. They're probably just going to get wherever they're going 2 minutes earlier anyway. What's the point? And so on. My mind flows this way because of the driving I've done, the people I've met, the movies I've watched, the books I've read, the kind of day I'm having, and any number of other influences that together breathe life into the voice of the mind. If I don't listen to that voice, that doesn't mean it isn't there influencing me. Sri Kantra counsels that we watch how our minds work and leaves the picture of a cloudless sky to your imagination. To me, part of being a spiritual warrior is practicing mindfulness when confronted with tyranny, whether in the form of petty tyrants we meet or those we carry around with us. The following passage sums it up nicely. It's taken from a Dhamma Reflections by Bhikkhuni Seri at Dhammaloka Buddhist Center in Western Australia. Tonight, I would like to explore the concept of spiritual warrior. When we hear the word warrior, we think of a fighter, a brave combatant, a person experienced or distinguished in fighting in an armed force, tribe, etc. The concept of spiritual warrior resonates with me. To me, spiritual warriors are trained and distinguished fighters on the spiritual path. They are not fighting on the killing field to harm. I associate spiritual warriors with qualities such as courage, determination, harmlessness, patience, truthfulness, integrity, renunciation, energy, loving kindness, compassion, and peace. Spiritual warriors practice for liberation and freedom. You could see some of that list of attributes matches with what Castaneda would say as attributes of a spiritual warrior. And then she continues later on, practice as spiritual warriors does not mean a spectacular display of fireworks or thunder and cheers. The practice of spiritual warriors is like strands that we weave into the fabric of our day-to-day living, wholeheartedly and patiently with love and care. The practice is like collecting water into the bucket of liberation, drop by drop and moment by moment.
Before Phil and I talked about this service, I'd heard of Carlos Castaneda, but I probably couldn't have told you very much about him. I probably would have described him as a Latin American author in the vein of Ernest Hemingway, peddling a philosophy of ultra-masculinity. Castaneda was a real character. He was born 95 years ago in Peru, and emigrated to the United States as a child. He was naturalized before attending UCLA to study anthropology. He may or may not have studied shamanism with a Yaqui man named Don Juan Matus. And even though he claimed he did, and that those studies were the basis for the series of books Phil talked about, it's now generally accepted as fact that the books are fiction. According to his great many followers, he sold millions of books after all, the wisdom contained in those books is very real and factual. Castaneda may or may not have been married to Margaret Runyon and may or may not have divorced her in 1960 or 1973, and her son, C.J. Castaneda, may or may not have been his biological son, affirmative birth certificate notwithstanding. There's a bit of Hemingway-style drama there. But the thing that really seals the literary comparison for me is his writings about warriors. In my mind, that meant blood, guts, and glory. I imagine Castaneda involved in something like the Yaqui version of the running of the bulls, an expression of rugged, fearless manhood. It's a silly idea, I know, especially since I should know better. A decade or so ago, in an effort to try to come up with a common language to help us with our work, a group of colleagues and I read The Fourfold Way. It was written by Angeles Arrien, who was born in the Basque region of Spain and, like Castaneda, emigrated to the United States as a child and studied what she called cross-cultural anthropology in California. In the book, she asserts that if we want to be effective at navigating a constantly changing world, we have to master the skills of 4 different archetypes. Archetypes, she points out, exist in every culture. The archetypes of warrior, healer, visionary, and teacher. Through my training and formation, I got to develop, thanks to a lot of growth opportunities, the skills of the healer, visionary, and teacher. The only difference is that in seminary, we called them teacher, preacher, and pastor. I also learned the hard way that you have to develop all these skills simultaneously. You can't just rely on being good at one, or you will be woefully inadequate in your work. You may not be perfectly balanced between them, but the more out of balance you are, the more likely it is that you'll burn yourself out. So healer, visionary, and teacher have always made sense to me. But warrior? What even is a warrior in a spiritual sense? How does a warrior function in a religiously liberal community like a Unitarian Universalist congregation? Angeles Arrien defined warrior as one who shows up and chooses to be present. A warrior knows that they can't control the situations that are forced upon them by life, but they can look deep inside themselves to control their own responses in order to help bring into being the best possible outcome for themselves and others. Even though Arrien doesn't use this language, I guess it's safe to say that a warrior is aware that event plus response equals outcome, and rather than running away from the event, chooses to focus their personal response to an event rather than an outcome. Arrien described 5 universal characteristics of a warrior. They become honorable by being willing to look at any situation differently without getting stuck in negativity. Warriors are judicious in their communication, saying what they mean and doing what they say, knowing when to speak up and when to keep still. They know their own physical, emotional, and spiritual limitations and set good boundaries between themselves and other people. Warriors are mindful that their responses affect outcomes. So they take responsibility for them and act with mindfulness and without delay. They seek what she calls right use of power, beginning with the understanding that each of us has, to varying degrees, power of presence, power of communication, and power of position. That I can work with, even though I have to be reminded about it periodically. So what about Castaneda? I now know that he described the warrior as having 4 attributes: control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. Forbearance is one of those oldie-timey words nobody uses anymore, but it's about endurance and self-control, knowing when to act and when to stay still. With that in mind, Castaneda's definition of a warrior doesn't seem too different from Arian's. It's not all macho BS. It's cross-cultural, and it's applicable to all genders. Recognizing the similarities made me realize that I have been held hostage by an idea that I was holding on to my own detriment. The idea that warriorship is an expression of a kind of masculinity that I don't seek to develop in myself. I needed to embrace the idea that being a warrior, a spiritual warrior, is to show up and to be willing to look at a situation differently without getting stuck in negativity. Being a spiritual warrior is in large part settling the monkey chatter in our minds, finding self-nourishment in the weeds we pull out and return to the fertile soil of our souls for the purpose of being mindful of our responses. Being a spiritual warrior is about facing the ideas that are holding us back, ideas that, if left unchecked, can become petty tyrants that dominate our lives and prevent us from being present. You probably know that for about 10 months now, along with a couple dozen other folks in the congregation, including Maggie, I've been involved in a regular meditation practice we call the prayer circle. We set our alarm clocks and get up before dawn. We gather, even if we don't feel well, even if the hour is way too dark and early, and sit together. We sit either in person in the Memorial Garden or virtually on Facebook Live for a few short prayers and 4 meditations. The meditations focus on 4 different active goals: naming, knowing, listening, and loving. Naming our gratitude and blessings. Knowing more about ourselves by reflecting honestly on our lives and relationships. Listening for the wisdom that can come up from deep within ourselves when we quiet our minds. And finally, a litany of love as we name as many people as we can. People like us who are simultaneously beautiful and broken, and accepting them just as they are. The prayers aren't calls to a super being asking for divine intervention into situations beyond our control. They're poems that ground us in the moment, and mantras that remind us of the power that lives within each of us to change ourselves and the world. Our gathering and engaging serve the purpose of building honor and respect, responsibility and discipline, nurturing judicious communication, setting limits and boundaries. Our gathering and engaging promote our right use of the powers of presence, communication, and position. Our gathering, our showing up and choosing to be present to each other and whatever else is going on in our lives, helps make us spiritual warriors. We know the practice is working when we can feel ourselves letting go of monkey mind, the mental chatter that would otherwise dominate our thoughts, preventing us from being healers, teachers, and visionaries that we all want to be. You might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter right now? When so much of the world is out of control and we are faced with a constant onslaught of insults and aggression, we are facing an epic election, one that by all indicators will witness record participation. Many see it as one in which we have the opportunity to vote out of office a tyrant who rules in self-interest. But maybe this is an opportunity to affect the outcome, not by focusing on the events, personalities that got us here in the first place, but by focusing on our own responses. I don't know about you, but during this election season, and if I'm honest, for the last 5 years, I feel like I've been having insults and curses hurled at me by neighbors and even family who see me as an enemy because of my beliefs. I've had dirt thrown at me and I've been spit at, literally and figuratively, because I've taken seriously my call to be a teacher, visionary, and healer. I've had to let go of the idea that to be a warrior is to carry the mantle of toxic, destructive masculinity. I've had to embrace the idea that my forbearance and discipline can serve me and the world. I've had to stop focusing on the events in the news, the chaos, the divisiveness, the dishonesty, and the self-service, and focus on my own response to it. I've had to let go of the idea of them as the enemy and therefore the cause of all the problems. I've had to hold more dearly onto the core ideal of this nation I wish to see come true: real equality for everyone in the eye of the law. So I ask you, what is the American ideal you wish to be real? And how can you respond to current events in a way that allows you to continue to strive for it, no matter what? What idea are you holding on to that has become a tyrant for you, holding you back from being a spiritual warrior? Answering those questions and paying attention to your responses rather than the outcome you want may just be the clue to surviving this election, regardless of the outcomes. May we all be spiritual warriors as we cast our ballots. May we all have the control, forbearance, and discipline to use this time to focus on what is really important. May we go into the polls as spiritual warriors, focused on those American ideals most important to us, and bringing them to life within ourselves. If we can do that, we'll be more effective in helping to bring into being the best possible outcomes for ourselves and our nation. During the Civil War, tariffs were amazingly high. They paid for the lion's share of the war against slavery. They hit everyone equally, so they were regressive. So the Republican Congress did something amazing and innovative at the time. They came up with a scaled income tax. The more you made, the larger the percentage of your income you paid. Unitarian newspaper publisher Horace Greeley claimed it was very popular in those days, even among conservatives. Now, I don't know about that. I do know that I had to pay my income taxes on Thursday's delayed deadline, and I wasn't happy. I asked my accountant if the thieves would just take the money from my account or if I'd have to suffer the added indignity of writing out a check to support the powerful and wealthy who brag about not paying taxes. Let it go. Let go of that idea that grips me every year like a tyrant. It's not easy sometimes, this warrior work. But one thing that is easier, each and every month, is writing out a check to East Shore to support the work and mission of this congregation. Work that I value, work that I hope you value. Writing that check makes me embrace my Unitarian jihad name, sibling howitzer of generosity. You can feel like sister sword of loving kindness or brother mallet of sweet reason by writing your check and sending it into our office. If you've been joining us for worship but aren't a member, you may want to consider sending us a little something to show your appreciation for the work that we're doing and to help ensure that it continues long into the future. Thank you all for being here with us today. As a benediction, an expression of hope for the days and weeks to come, I'd like to offer you this blessing, which includes Angelus Arrien's descriptions of the fourfold way. May we be warriors by showing up and choosing to be present. May we be healers by paying attention to that which has heart and meaning. May we be visionaries by telling the truth without judgment or blame. May we be teachers by being open to outcomes, not attached to them.
On your mark, get set, go.
We join hands in Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, pledging ourselves to an individual freedom,
which transcends all creeds.
Think alike.
Of journey together.
Okay, we got it.